All right, good afternoon. It's nice to see some paleo talks in this session. Thanks to the conveners for folding that in. The talk after me by Gene Wall will also be on paleo. I want to make sure I thank Ben, Ed, and Richard for not only making this work insightful but also fun. They're great co-authors, as well as NOAA and NSF for paying the rent. Oh, I need a different keyboard. You want to get the one out from underneath it? So quickly, what are the motivations for the study that I'm going to walk through? Those of us working at Lamont on these problems, it's all about the base. We really want to understand decadal, decennial hydroclimate variability and dynamics better. I think you'd all agree that we need a lot of work on that. And we're limited by the instrumental record in our ability to actually look at those timescales. So if we're actually going to understand this better, we need to start thinking creatively about how we merge models and data to both give us an understanding of how hydroclimate has changed in the past and then also have that give some bearing on our understanding of the projections into the future. The holy grail, of course, is to use paleo in some ways to refine risk assessments of future hydroclimate change. And so that's, I think, the goal and the advantage of trying to fold the paleo information in. But this question stands, what should we use to characterize hydroclimate variability across these different timescales and data sources? And so that's a big question. And I just say that these motivations define a study on which I'm presenting on today, but that's in review at the Journal of Climate, and hopefully it'll be out in a reasonable amount of time. So I'm going to talk specifically about a few drought metrics that we use a lot in paleo and are looking at within the models, and I just want to get everybody on the same page here. I'll be talking about 3 different flavors of the Palmer Drought Severity Index. The different formulations considered are the Thornthwaite, the Penman-Montieth, and the Self-Calibrating PDSI formulations. These are basically moisture balance calculations where the inputs are precipitation, and the real difference in the formulations are in the way that potential evapotranspiration is calculated. So in the Thornthwaite formulation, PET is largely scaled according to temperature with a latitude component, whereas the Penman-Montieth is a more physical accounting using surface moisture and energy balance accounting. Self-calibrating PDSI is different from Penman-Montieth only in the sense that it typically uses the Penman-Montieth formulation, but includes the spatially varying vegetation and soil properties instead of parameters from a field in Kansas. As far as PDSI Thornthwaite, so I'll be noting these different PDSI formulations this way, but one of the things that's in the literature that you may have seen is that because of the scaling of Thornthwaite to temperature, when you exceed the normalization interval that's used for the calculations in temperature, you dry out more than is physically reasonable, and that can really be seen in these model time series here. So in blue is the PDSI Penman-Montieth formulation, and red is the Thornthwaite formulation, and this is over the historical interval into the projections, and where you really see this deviation between the two formulations is in the projection interval. This is the RCP 8.5 projection where things get really warm. Penman-Montieth stays wetter than the drying Thornthwaite projection, and so that's been discussed as a problem of Penman-Montieth or of Thornthwaite PDSI, and something that we look at in terms of its impact on the blending of these paleo and model estimates. Did you start the timer? I'm limitless, Ed, I guess. Okay, so what are the motivations for using PDSI? Just a couple things. First of all, when you're comparing across, say, GCMs, the way that the land surface schemes are tuned, parameterized, their sophistication is all variable across the models. And so one of the nice things about PDSI is that you use atmospheric variables to do the accounting, so it essentially homogenizes the moisture balance calculation across the different models that you're looking at. It's also, in many cases, something that we can use as a proxy for soil moisture variability over even the observational interval, in the sense that we don't have a lot of soil moisture observations, and so for doing things like model validations, it's an alternative for doing those kinds of things. The other thing in the paleo literature is that the Drought Atlas reconstructions that are used so widely that Ed Cook and many co-authors have worked on in North America, in the Monsoon Asia drought region, as well as the Old World Drought Atlas that's now becoming available, all target PDSI as a reconstruction variable. And specifically with regard to the North American Drought Atlas, which I'll be referring to as the NADA, PDSI Thornthwaite has been what has been targeted. And so there's this question about whether or not the Thornthwaite the Thornthwaite biases, where temperatures increase significantly, have affected these reconstruction products. And so one of the motivations for this study actually comes from the Sheffield et al. Nature paper, in which they speculate that the paleoclimate reconstructions of drought may be particularly susceptible because they are often developed by scaling tree ring data to match the calculated PDSI for their overlap period. So this is something that we wanted to look at in this study. But I also want to give a couple more motivations for using PDSI. In watching some of the discussions about the drought projections or ongoing droughts, there's this confusion about drought, meteorological drought, and agricultural drought. And these integrated metrics, I think, are really important, and you see it in the projections. So I've circled North America specifically. This is a PDSI calculation over the 21st century. And you can see that much of North America is projected to dry. If you look at a PDSI calculation where you hold the temperature constant, there is small increases in the wetness over North America, and it's only when you include the component of drying associated with the temperature increases that you get these drying areas over North America. You see that over the Mediterranean region as well, in the sense that the temperature is really expanding the drying around the Mediterranean rim in a way that you don't see if you consider just precipitation. And I should mention that this was Ben's paper that was published just earlier this year on the projections within the CMIP 5 ensemble. Another thing of motivation is when we look at the past. So these are time series of PDSIs. This is the NADA time series for the American Southwest. And these are just two model examples of the same time series from the same region in PDSI. You can see the red sections here. These are the mega droughts that are a robust feature of the Southwest hydroclimate in the early part of the second millennium. And we find that the models simulate mega droughts, but they don't put them, they're not phased in the same locations as the reconstructions, indicating that they might not be forced. They may be a component of internal variability. If we look at the characteristics, the persistence characteristics, so this is the number of droughts of 10, 15, or 20-year lengths. The different colors here are some of the last millennium simulations from the PMIP 3 ensemble. The X's are the NADA. This is the average drought severity during those 10, 15, and 20-year droughts. And it's variable across the models. They get this persistence all right, but they do it in different ways. And so when we think about comparing the paleoclimate record in this last millennium context and then translating that into implications for the projections, we really have to think about how to blend these paleoclimate intervals with what we know from the models about projections into the future. And so that's something that also motivates this study. So just a few results that we've looked into on this. I'm going to be showing you results from 3 different regions in North America: the Four Corners, the North Plains, and the Southeast regions. So those are the gray regions. In red here are tree ring sites that we'll use to do some tree ring reconstructions. But the first thing that we looked at from each of these regions are just time series of PDSI, Thornthwaite, Penman-Montieth, and Self-Calibrating PDSI. So those are represented in the various colors in the North Plains, the Four Corners, and the Southeast, and this is over the historical interval from 1900 up through 2005. And really the take-home here is that the observational data of these 3 different PDSI formulations compares very well. These are the different paired shared variances among those different variables. All of them are above about 0.83. So significant shared variances. The really only differences are in some of the regions are differences in amplitude. So that does come out, and you can see that that's in some cases characteristic of the PDSI Thornthwaite. So again, this factor that may be associated with temperature in these regions. But what we've done is then used each of these time series as targets for the paleoclimate reconstructions to test the dependence of our reconstructions on calibrating over these different time series. So that's what this is really stepping through. So again, those 3 regions, the Four Corners, the North Plains, the Southeast. The red in here are those target series, and the black and gray are the reconstruction products that we've derived for this. The take-home is that they all compare to the instrumental data very well and calibrate very well on each of these products. When you look at the reconstructions over the full time interval, so the time scale down here is 1000 AD up through 2005, these are the different reconstructions targeting the different PDSI formulations. And the take-home here is that it doesn't really matter what you calibrate the tree ring data on, whether it's PDSI Thornthwaite, Penman-Montieth, or self-calibrating, you get very similar results. There's some differences. What these are showing is different validation characteristics, and I'm not going to go into the reconstruction methods too much, but we can derive cross-validation statistics for how well these reconstructions actually reproduce the target data, and for the most part, the validations are all suggest that they are skillful reconstructions, and they all validate fairly similarly. So take home on this is that these reconstructions seem to all be very similar regardless of the PDSI formulation that we target. If we compare the reconstructions to Ed's North American Drought Atlas reconstructions, so I'm not going to go into the methods, but they're done in very different ways and target the PDSI data differently. The story is very similar here. The reconstructions that we derive for all of the different PDSI formulations compare very similarly to the NADA results, which gives us an indication that our results are at least applicable and shed some light on how to interpret the NADA in terms of its biases, and all of this suggests that there in fact are not biases in the sense that the NADA has targeted the PDSI Thornthwaite, and we don't get anything different regardless of which PDSI formulation we target. Okay, so what about the models? What we've done in this case is calculated PDSI Thornthwaite and Penman-Montieth, and then pulled a couple soil moisture variables out of the models. In one case, the full column soil moisture, in another, the 30 centimeter soil moisture. And the take home here is that these soil moisture variables all compare very well in the models over the observational interval with the PDSI calculations. The biggest differences are associated with the full column soil moisture, which in these models goes down to either 3 meters in the CAN-ESM model and as much as 50 meters in the CCSM model. They all compare fairly well, where the full column soil moisture has some lags, as you would expect, as it represents a deeper variable. But what this tells us is that this period over the instrumental interval is a good period for stitching these products together. The reconstruction shown here in black and gray, the model results over the historical interval, and then the projections moving forward. Where we see the real big differences are in the projections, the 21st century projections. So you see these things separating out in significant ways, where you see the Thornthwaite drying more than it should. But what's interesting is actually when you start comparing the different soil moisture variables within the model, there's differences there as well. And this is often confused when you see people talk about the projections or the model results in general. Often they're talking about different model variables, whether it's the full column soil moisture or layers within the models. These maps are showing how it breaks out spatially. The colors, if you have colors, it's where comparisons between, say, PDSI and 30 centimeter soil moisture all agree in the direction of drying or wetting, and we've paired this in different ways. The point here is that when you look at the projection interval, things get to be a little bit more complicated, and I think we have a lot of work to do to understand how the different soil moisture variables or moisture metrics actually influence the projections that we're deriving in the model projections. I'm going to skip over this part because I'm running out of time and just get to my conclusions. And just summarize what we've learned from this study. What we found is that the tree ring-based PDSI reconstructions are robust to the selection of PDSI. I should mention that the Penman-Montieth is considered a much more physical variable. We get a very similar result when we target that variable relative to the Thornthwaite variable that has these problems if you use it in the model projections moving into the future. Comparisons between the observational, paleoclimate, and modeled data over the 20th century are largely insensitive to the choice of PDSI metric, making this, I think, an important interval for how we stitch these products together. There's nothing magical about it. It's just the interval over which these things are normalized, and so they compare well over that period, and it's useful for stitching these different products together. As far as the model projections, we're really finding that Thornthwaite, in support of other studies that have shown this, Thornthwaite really suggests a significant drying that's not physical, whereas PDSI, Penman-Montieth, or other near-surface normalized soil moisture products are the appropriate variables to look at when you're going into the projection interval. And I would simply conclude that as far as how these variables characterize hydroclimatic changes into the future, there's a lot of open questions about how the models, first of all, are configured to simulate soil moisture in the future and how they behave depending on which model variable you look at. And then also, if we use these offline calculations like PDSI, there are some differences that we still need to work out and understand in the way that they characterize the projections into the future. So with that, I'm going to take questions, but none of you have them. It seems to be the characterization of the session, but if you do have them, I'm happy to take them. Yes?
When you look into the future, then there's a bit of a problem because Thornthwaite, although limited, is relatively robust in the sense it's dependent on temperature, whereas Penman-Montieth is actually dependent on a whole set of downscale variables, which are quite uncertain because of the nature of downscaling.
Right.
So maybe that's part of the explanation for your divergence. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, it gets complicated. I mean, I think that what's a robust feature of Thornthwaite is that when you get outside of the normalization interval, it scales almost linearly in terms of the PET that it's calculating. It just dries too much, and that's a big problem. What you see with Penman-Montieth is there are regional differences, and we haven't sorted all of that out. If you compare Penman-Montieth to soil moisture, whether it's a near surface or full column soil moisture, there are places where they agree well and there's places where they diverge. One of the things that we've been looking at is the influence of the vegetation parameterizations and how they respond to CO2 increases into the future, which we think actually influences some of the local hydroclimate in a way that Penman-Montieth is not calculating. So I think there's multiple things to sort out in this, and it's something that we see when we look at the projections. There's no rule of thumb characterization of how Penman-Montieth behaves relative to the model soil moisture values, but this excess drying of Thornthwaite is something that you see pretty much in all of these calculations. Thank you.